Yoga is a healthy practice that is enjoyed by millions of people around the world. It provides them with numerous different benefits. But when we think of yoga for lower back pain, we've come across YouTube videos, we come across classes specifically recommended. Are these really the best thing that you can do to help recover from lower back pain or sciatica? Today, that's what we're going to be discussing. And hopefully by the end of this episode, you will have a renewed appreciation for yoga, but also a renewed understanding about its role in your short, medium, and long-term lower back health, whether you're recovering from back pain or sciatica. And first, I think it's important to identify that yoga is great. Lots of different people benefit in lots of different ways, both physical and mental and spiritual, from this sort of practice, from the social benefits they get, the meditative benefits they get, and some of the physical benefits as well. It can offer lots for a variety of different purposes and people that come to the practice from all over the world. But quite often, people don't appreciate fully the challenge that yoga can offer. And those experienced, fantastic practitioners of yoga, we don't necessarily appreciate or stop to appreciate just how physically endowed they are, how good they are at the practice of yoga, the strength, the flexibility, the body control, etc. And we can see, some of us, we can see the things that they have built over their many years of practice and how great they are, and work to attain that level of skill through regular practice. But it's important that we distinguish between that sort of practice and the sort of practice that's required when we have lower back pain. And if we take a simple, very, very common example, and I looked up before we went through something I've seen in the past, an article by Healthline, which is a very widely known online source of health information, and they talk about 10 yoga exercises to help you with your lower back, and downward dog was one of them. And I wanted to just tease apart the downward dog specifically in this particular episode and just look at it for what it really is. In order to do a downward dog properly, you've got to have incredible flexibility through the lower body. You've got to have great dorsiflexion, that's being able to bring your toes towards your nose at your ankle. You've got to have good flexibility through the hamstrings and the hips in order to hip hinge correctly and whilst holding a neutral spine. And then you've got to have tremendous shoulder flexibility and strength in order to effectively perform this activity. It is a challenging thing to do properly. Sure, you can all do a bad downward dog, and there are problems with that, which we'll get into in a moment. And most of the people that do downward dog are not going to be doing it properly. If there is a proper form, they're not going to be doing it with the straight legs. They're not going to be doing it with the ankles or the heels rather touching the floor. They're not going to be doing it with a correct hip hinge. Their back is going to be rounded. Then instead of looking like a mountain or a triangle, they're going to look maybe like myself when I do it, like more like a hill, a rounded hill. And they're just not doing it correctly because it requires extreme physical conditioning to be able to do that. And we have to appreciate that balance between strength, but more flexibility in various key areas to do this activity. And one of the things as I was writing the article that goes alongside this particular episode, I had to think about something like the downward dog, which is such a common exercise, it's almost synonymous with yoga, and a 100-kilo deadlift. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that you could probably get more people able to competently deadlift 100 kilos sooner than you could get them to competently do a downward dog effectively with all the correct training points. And I think it would be a worthwhile experiment to do at some point in the future, but it really is that simple. Yet people on the one hand would say, well, I've got back pain right now. I've got sciatica right now. I couldn't dream of doing a 100-kilo deadlift, but I'll try a downward dog. And what happens when both of these things go wrong? Well, when the deadlift goes wrong, our back rounds, we get problems. When the downward dog goes wrong, our back rounds, we do other things. And this is the important thing, that we have to take a step back and be humble about yoga. Yoga is actually a really difficult thing to do properly. And if we're not doing it properly, we're exposing our body to stress and strain. And if we're coming to this from the table of being a healthy individual that has no back pain, that has no problems or injuries, and you want to get into a healthy practice, then sure. But most of you guys watching our episodes and watching our YouTube channel and members, you're not going to yoga from the position of being a healthy person. You've got a back pain. You've got maybe a bulging disc. You've got a sciatica in the lower back, maybe some other issues down there in the lumbar spine. And you are coming to yoga or have been maybe recommended yoga as a remedy for that. And that's the wrong sort of approach, because you wouldn't dream of trying other activities that require high levels of physical skill and competence when you have a lower back injury. And hopefully by this point, we've very quickly established that actually yoga is a higher order skill. We're going to put it in the category of a sport, and you don't take up sport when you have an injury. You wait until the appropriate time to take up sport when we have an injury and we're looking to recover. And that's probably the big point straight out the gate for you to start to wrestle with if you've been looking at yoga as a practice to help your lower back pain and recover from sciatica. So let me get into why is yoga not appropriate for someone with lower back pain or a lower back injury. And the big mistake comes from spinal movement. Now, I mentioned that article that I looked at on the 10 exercises. Now, obviously, one of them was a downward dog. The other one was, I think, the extended triangle. Okay, both of these activities will not be done correctly in someone with back pain. Why? Because the person who's in back pain they struggle to move, number one. They struggle to move effectively. They often have a lot of tension, stiffness in the hip muscles, which means they're not going to be able to assume the correct position properly. And therefore, they're going to be doing it incorrectly or less favorably, and that's going to put stress and strain on different areas of the lower back, which is not going to be helpful in the recovery process. So that's the one thing. Then the other exercises that were in that list that weren't the sort of pose positions, they involved more or less all of them, various movements of the lower back. And when you first injure the lower back, when you have any injury, you don't start wiggling around the joints that are damaged. You don't start wiggling around these sorts of injured structures. If I've just sprained my finger and it's just been bent off to the side, I don't start wiggling it to the side loads to try and help it recover. I back off and I focus on spinal stability, which is something we'll get to later. And fundamentally, most of these exercises, we've got the child's pose. We've got other sorts of pose, maybe even the pigeon pose. We've got, obviously, the downward dog, which will end up rounding the lower back, and many of the others in this sort of list of standard yoga exercises for back pain all involve forward bending of the spine, or in the majority forward bending the spine, or they involve rotating and bending and twisting the spine. And when you have a back injury, you do not need that, because for a structure to be injured, it is now less stable than it otherwise could be. And therefore movement, any given movement, because you're not able to control movement to the segment, because we aren't as human beings, no one can, we now inadvertently put more movement through that injured structure because the other segments won't move as well, because they won't need to, because there's this wobbly one which will take up all the movement first, the injured one, unfortunately. And then we get into the topic of the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who injure their lower back do it into forward bending. They bent down to touch their toes. They bent down to pick something up. They did this, that, the other. It's all forward bending. So we're repeating the activity that injured our lower back in the first place, that caused that bulging disc backwards or off to the side, one side or other, that damaged the ligaments that support a nice, neutral, healthy spine. So repeating that same movement over and over again, just like I said with the finger, is not a sensible move. And then you get the question of, okay, well, what about the backward bending? Now, backward bending on the surface of it, things like, I think it was the locust pose, cobra and sphinx poses, basically pushing up and extending the back. On the surface of it, you think, okay, that makes sense. The problem is when you injure the lower back structures, the segments, especially if we've got any disc change or significant change in disc height, vis-a-vis herniations or degenerate discs, etc., you have a degree of instability. So instead of all of the joints bending backwards or bending forwards, and in this case bending backwards, you get a process of shearing because they don't bend anymore, because there's not a degree of natural tension holding the spinal joints in place so they bend properly. The joints at the lumbar spine will shear, which is why so often people find those activities like pushing up into the cobra actually painful when they have a lower back injury or sciatica, because it's moving the joints in a way they're not happy to do, because they are not structurally sound. Because that's what you have when you have an injured joint. It is not structurally sound, and therefore it will not move the way in which it should move. And just bending things one way or the other, for example, like this pen, is not going to allow us to target movement through other areas. We're inevitably going to target movement through the area of that is weakest and least competent, vis-a-vis the injured segment. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding. And then we get to probably the final two criticisms. One is specifically with yoga, and the other is a little bit more conceptual. And this is that in order to recover effectively from lower back pain or an injury to the back, herniated disc, whatever it is, you need to rebuild strength. And yoga uses body weight, parts of body weight, the whole of the body, etc. And that is not providing the stimulation necessary to help those tissues not just heal, but heal and then remodel and rebuild the strength and integrity and ability to bear load. Life has load. And if we're just using yoga as a sole tool to strengthen or rehabilitate our back, as we'll discuss a little bit later, we're missing that crucial aspect, which is load. We have to have some element of safe application of steadily increasing load done at the right time in the right way in order to rebuild our lower back and re-strengthen our lower back and the health of the surrounding tissues. And that cannot be done, or is not done, through yoga practice, because it doesn't incorporate load, simply put. And then we get to the final part, which is more of a criticism, or hopefully not a criticism, because it's not meant to be said in a bad way per se, but it's just to point out the obvious. And that is, yoga is a great practice. It's got many great tools. And yes, it can be applied in sensible ways to help someone with the lower back and recover from lower back pain. We could incorporate many yoga strategies to improve or complement a holistic approach to recovering from lower back pain. But you have to have the education, the understanding, and the knowledge about the lumbar spine specifically. And going on a short week course or 2-week course or something like that is not going to be sufficient. You know, to be completely frank, we have osteopaths, physiotherapists, chiropractors, doctors, etc. And there are many great ones, but there are many that recommend all these sorts of exercises, and they've got degrees, master's degrees, they've got other education backing them of significantly greater magnitude, and they're still making these same mistakes. How do we know this? Because clinically, we were being referred patients and had patients coming in being told to do these things erroneously by previously qualified people. We also have many members, most of which have seen other people, most of which have gone, I think it was about 40% on our last survey, 40% of members had some form of injections or surgery prior to joining the program. So these people have seen lots of people who've been giving them these exercises and they don't work because they don't follow the various principles that are important in order to effectively recover from lower back pain. So that's something that we can't escape. And to expect our yoga teacher or yoga practitioner to be clued up to that level, to be able to have the academics to incorporate an effective strategies with a yoga twist on them to really build back your lower back from injury or from the very initial point of injury, it's just not a fair expectation of your yoga teacher. And that's why I think some of these things get added in. You're not going to get much difference really in a yoga practice versus a practice you're going to get from your physio here in the UK. For example, your NHS physio, when you go to them, they're probably going to be recommending more or less similar sort of activities and practices on the surface level, and that's fundamentally why it doesn't work, because there's just not that understanding there. That's not to say that's the same for across the board, but if you're being recommended yoga exercises like the knee hugs, child's pose, downward dog, etc., they're just not the right movements for the reasons we've already mentioned. So we wanted to finish this episode up by hopefully giving you some principles to move forwards with, so you can better understand how to evaluate the sorts of exercises you're going to do, and then some final thoughts on yoga specifically, because it does have a role. It's just how we apply that role. And the first thing is we need to provide stability. We need to, as a first port of call, learn to stabilize the spine. And that does not involve movement. That does not involve bending, twisting, or any of those other sorts of things. And that's vital. The second point is decompressing the spine, unloading the spine. And you might be told that decompressing the spine is something like a child's pose. And there is truth to a part of that. We are decompressing a part of the spine, but at the expense of other areas of the spine and at the expense of other issues. And we covered in a lot of detail quite recently a step-by-step guide on decompressing your lower back at home. And you can definitely check out that video, a link in the description or around the video somewhere right now as you're watching this. The next point number 3 is lordosis support. We have to support the natural lordosis. Our lower back should have a natural backward bending curve, a backward bending curve that is constantly being assaulted by sitting too much every day, at work, at home, in transit between those places. The average adult spends about 9.5 hours a day, according to British Heart Foundation, and sitting down, and that is just too much. And when we're sitting, we're just eliminating that lordosis, which is arguably at the cause or a significant factor preventing your back pain recovering. So we need to have a strategy to support the lordosis, and we talk about things like the towel exercise, etc., to do that and support the natural backward bending curve. Note, there is a big difference between supporting the natural backward bending curve and bending the back backwards more, and we discussed that in other episodes, so I won't bore you guys with that on today's episode. The next thing, number 4, is building in stability and control safely. Now, yoga can to a certain degree do this, and this is where we start to think about the correct application of these sorts of things, and with an educated mind with regards to the spine, we could potentially pick and choose some yoga postures, etc., that might well help us develop a degree of stability and control. But the final point number 5, is we have to add load, and we have to use load as the guiding stick, the conductor of the orchestra, guiding our body to healing and becoming stronger. Load is the only way we can do that, or is an essential part of our back pain recovery. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's the right time, right place, with the right technique. Load being applied will complement and be essential to that recovery process, recovering from back injuries and or sciatica. I think the final thoughts here are with regards to yoga. Treat yoga with respect. It is a skill. It is something that requires a lot of skill in many different areas to be able to do. Yoga certainly has a place, especially if you're someone that's interested in how the body works and better understanding your own body. And we go to great pains to provide a lot of education within the Back in Shape program for our members, and those people are going to be, if you're watching this and you're a member, you're going to have a better understanding of how you can incorporate selectively parts of yoga to be part of your long-term back health and recovery. But we cannot do it in its entirety, i.e. yoga is not the solution to back pain. Yoga is something that we should treat and say, actually, there are some great attributes that people that are good at yoga have. They've built good flexibility in the hips, good body control, etc. That's something that is unmistakably going to be helpful for your back health in the long term. But right now, if you've got really bad back pain or sciatica, or you've been diagnosed on an MRI with XYZ condition, you need to focus on getting better. And right now, yoga is not going to be the right thing for you. It's going to be something that you work to add in, just like you add in other sports or pastimes. Work on learning to do yoga in the future, once you've rebuilt your back. Add it in as something that can enhance and complement the sorts of resistance training exercises that you're going to do that will build the foundations of back health. And then yoga can be part and parcel of your daily routine for the long term. But it's just not right now while you're struggling. So hopefully this episode has been informative, made you think about yoga, and hopefully you do appreciate that we do appreciate yoga. We have a lot of respect for the practitioners and the skill and the competence that many high-level yoga practitioners are going to be displaying, because it is it's hard work to get to that level, to do some of the things that you see these guys teaching classes, etc., to do. But just like with all good athletic achievement, we don't need to be starting out or embarking on a new sport, learning the ropes, learning the technique, making the mistakes that come alongside beginner level activities when we have a back injury. So hopefully you've reevaluated how you're going to apply yoga to your back health for the long term. If you do have any questions as a result of this, maybe on the surface of it, controversial episode, then please do post them in the comments below. And remember, we've got 3 ways we can help you. Number 1, we have episodes just like this on the YouTube channel, on the podcast, to help you understand a little bit more about your back. And hopefully this has been a great example of something that on the surface maybe could have been purported to be helpful for the back, but actually now with this renewed understanding of yoga, we can understand better how it applies to back health for the short, medium and long term, and where it's most effectively deployed. We also have the membership, which is our way to help you go through a structured approach to rebuild your back and actually fix your back pain from home, recovering from all sorts of different lower back injuries. And then we also have, more recently, the ability for you guys to come and visit us and get some of the treatment here at the studio, as well as virtual consultations as well, to support you if you are struggling and you can't get down to the space here. So look forward to seeing you in the next video, and hopefully you found this one helpful.